Alrighty, in this video we're going to put together a really basic game mechanic for shooting out projectiles that follow a path to a destination and then automatically destroy themselves. The projectiles will be interesting in that A, they'll eventually be able to be destroyed by the player, and B, they will affect the player by giving him damage. So let's go ahead and figure this out. Alright, so we're going to be working a little bit on the level here by adding adding a place for there to be this mechanic in the level here momentarily. But for right now, let's go ahead and jump into Visual Studio and work on the implementation of the code. So the idea is that we'll have a place, some sort of transform in the world, and that place will shoot a projectile during a regular interval. And then that projectile, if it hits a player, will hurt the player. Okay, we're going to start by going into our code folder and creating a new class, and I'm going to call it a, how about a pathed projectile spawner. So this is going to be responsible for instantiating a projectile that will be following a path. So what I want to go ahead and do is delete out our namespace stuff and then add in a mono behavior as what we're going to be inheriting, since this will be a mono behavior. And then I'm going to add some public properties. I'm going to add a public transform destination. I'm going to add a public game object projectile, public float speed, and a public float fire rate. Now, this public game object projectile, for right now it'll be a game object so that we don't get any squigglies. But what I want to do is I actually want to create a mono behavior that has a method on it that allows me to set some parameters when that prefab is instantiated. Alright, so let's go ahead and say for our private variables, we'll need a private float next shot in seconds. Then on start, our start method, I'm going to set next shot in seconds to fire rate. On the update method, I'm going to say if next shot in seconds minus equals time.delta time is greater than 0, return. Otherwise, set next shots in seconds to fire rate. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var projectile equals, and this is where I'm going to throw in that bit of logic here, where we're going to have another type here. So I'm going to say pathed projectile. I'm going to say instantiate projectile at transform.position and transform.rotation. Now the projectile, I'll simply say projectile.initialize. And I'll pass in the destination and the speed. Now, remember, we're going to be changing this from game object to something else, or specifically we're going to be changing it to path projectile, and we haven't written the path projectile class yet. So that's going to be, when it shoots, all it does is it instantiates a prefab and initializes it, passing in the destination and speed. The final thing I want to do with this class is on draw gizmos. I want to draw a line in the scene view that shows where this projectile is going to shoot. So I'm going to say if destination is null, then return. Then I want to set the gizmos.color to red, indicating that this is going to be a path projectile. And I want to say gizmos.drawLine transform.position destination.position. Okay, so that'll give us a visual indication of our pathed projectile. Let's go ahead and fix our game object up here. It's going to be a pathed projectile instead of a projectile. And the reason I want to do it like this is I want to show you guys is that you can create a prefab that has a component on it of a specific type, and then you can set that prefab as set that prefab as a value to a public field such as projectile. And then when you instantiate it, you can simply cast it into that type that you defined your prefab's parameter as, or your prefab's field as. So let's go ahead and create the path projectile mono behavior. The path projectile mono behavior will be responsible, of course, for handling the sort of logic that's needed for a projectile to move from one point to another. So I'm going to go up here in code, and I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to create a pathed projectile. Take off the namespace, and have it inherit from mono behavior, which of course will bring in Unity Engine at the top. Now if we jump back into path projectile, all the code now works, except for, of course, our initialize method that we invoke on it. That's because we haven't written the initialize method yet. So let's jump back into path projectile and work first on its data. It's going to need a private transform target, or let's just do destination to follow the same terminology that we used in our path projectile spawner. It's going to need a private float speed to know how fast it's going. Then I'm going to go ahead and throw in a, well, actually, that's really all we need. So I'm going to go ahead and throw in our method, our public void initialize method that takes in a transform destination and a float speed. We'll set our destination to destination, and we'll set our speed to speed. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and write our update method. So we'll go public void update. Now the update method will simply say transform dot position equals vector3 dot move towards transform dot position target, or sorry, so transform position destination position for the target, and then for the speed we'll do time delta time times underscore speed. Then I'm going to say var distance squared equals the destination's transform dot position minus our transform dot position, and then I'll get the square magnitude from it. Then I'm going to say if distance squared is greater than 0.01f times 0.01f, or 0.1f squared, then return. Otherwise, destroy the game object. That means it's reached its destination and the game object should be destroyed. Alright, so for our path projectile, this is really all we need. All this is an object that's capable of receiving a destination and moving towards that destination with a specified speed. As far as what we want the path projectile to do to the player, we'll handle that as a take damage that will add to the same component. So the path projectile will have a take damage component, or give damage component. Now I did mention before that we want these path projectiles to be destroyable by the player, but we're going to be adding that in a later video, and we're not going to have to write the code in that here. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump back into Unity, and let's put together let's first put together our path projectile prefab. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into Textures, Texture Atlas Main, and I'm going to bring in a blue buzzsaw. Actually, is it the blue one or I want the smaller one. I want the red buzzsaw.
Yeah, we want the red one.
All right, so the red one is going to be a path projectile that will be launched towards whatever path that we define for our path projectile spawner. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at it, and let's put together some components on it. So I'm going to, first of all, set its sorting layer to foreground. Then I'm going to add a component to it called pathed projectile. Then I'm going to add a component called give damage to player with the damage to give set to 10. Then I'm going to add a box collider 2D to it. Actually, no. I'm going to add a circle collider 2D to it, which, as you see, fits very nicely in this particular instance. And that's really all I need for my very basic path projectile. So we need to turn it into a prefab. I mean, it's a good idea to turn it into a prefab anyway, but we also definitely need to turn it into a prefab because our path projectile spawners are going to be responsible for instantiating them. So let's go ahead and, in our prefabs folder, create a new folder. And I'm going to call this folder Projectiles. Then I'm going to take this object right here, this red saw, and I'm going to rename it to path projectile red saw, and I'm going to prefabify it by dropping it right into the projectiles folder. Then I can delete it. because we don't need it anymore. All right, so now that I've done that, we can go ahead and create a path projectile spawner that'll be responsible for instantiating this prefab and causing this prefab to hit the player, in which case it'll give damage to the player. We also have to make sure that we set the is trigger to true on the circle collider of the path projectile so that the give damage script works properly. Okay, so this little jump pad guy, I'm actually gonna delete. No, I'm just gonna move all these platforms kind of uppish. We'll place them somewhere else later, I guess, or just delete them later. I don't know. I don't know what we want to do with these guys yet. We'll figure it out though. Let's go ahead and move those guys up.
We know we want them out of the way.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so I want to go ahead and create a path projectile. I think right here would be a good place for it. So first of all, I'm going to delete checkpoint 2 and move checkpoint 1 all the way to the right. And then I'm just going to delete these stars for now. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this block. And I'm going to take these 2 blocks and I'm going to duplicate them by hitting Control D, hold down Control so I'm snapping, and move them all the way over to the right hand side. So this way we can place a cool little cannon right here that'll shoot buzzsaws over into this direction. So let's go ahead and create a cannon. So I'm going to go into textures, I'm going to go into the texture atlas main, and I'm going to take a cannon and I'm just going to place it. Now you see it's kind of backwards right now, so let's go ahead and let's change its scale to -1 so that it's facing the opposite direction. And let's place it right there. And I want this cannon to be responsible for shooting out these little buzzsaws. Now the cannon is actually going to just be a piece of art, really. The projectile spawner itself shouldn't be the cannon itself. What it should be is it should be a transform that's inside of the cannon up here so that the objects spawn right there as opposed to in the center. And then I also need to create another object to indicate the destination of those projectiles. So the first thing I'm going to do is set the sorting layer to foreground. Then, actually, I don't know if it looks better behind the grass or ahead of the grass. We can modify that, of course, by changing the layer order. Maybe in front of the grass looks better. So let's change the order and layer to 3. Okay, so let's create the path projectile spawner and the destination path for it. So I'm going to say game object create empty, and I'm going to call this projectile spawner, and I'm going to child it to cannon. Then I'm going to move the position of the projectile spawner right about where I want the projectiles to be spawned from. Then I'm going to create another empty game object, and I'm going to call this, how about destination? And I'm going to parent it to cannon, and I'm going to move it about where it needs to go in order to, well, be over here basically. So on the projectile spawner, I'll note a y of 1.7, and I'll set that same y value for my destination so that it's only moving in the x direction. And then I'll create something right there. Now what I want to do is go to my projectile spawner and add a component called path projectile spawner. Let's say with a speed of 4 and a fire rate of 1 every 1 second. Now we have to set the destination and we have to set the target projectile. So to set the destination, we click and drag the destination up to destination, and to set the projectile, we want to go ahead and find that prefab in our prefabs folder, projectiles. We get path projectiles, and we'll just click and drag that onto, whoops, I didn't select the projectile spawner. We'll click and drag path projectile right here onto projectile. The last thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and destination. I want to set it as an icon. I just want to set it as a little gray thing so that we can see exactly or see very visually where that destination ends. And then I might want to do the same thing with the projectile spawner itself so we can see what is the muzzle of this object and what is the destination of this object. And that just gives us a really nice visual feedback. Okay. Next up, I want to go ahead and prefabify my cannon because I want to be able to use this multiple times in multiple levels. Because it is a very nice, reusable, self-contained component because all of its dependencies are children of itself, which is really cool. So now if we go ahead and hit play, we should see those buzzsaws being created and then destroyed. And then you see that we do indeed lose a bunch of health because we kind of get stuck in the... It seems that our Y value on our knockback and our give damage really isn't working the way that I want it to. So let's jump out of Unity, jump back into Visual Studio, locate our give damage to script, player script, and let's up its Y modifier. Let's up it to the same thing as the X. So let's say 15. Well, no, maybe like 3 or 5 minimum, and then 30 maximum. And then come back into Unity. What I really want to see here is I want these projectiles to knock me up and back. There we go. That looks good. Now, this isn't exactly what we want here because this is kind of impossible. So what we can do is we can go ahead and jump into our projectile spawner and set its fire rate to like or how about every 2 seconds. And then
You have
also
no idea how excited I am.
maybe set its speed up to 6. How excited you are?
Yes. Because our buzzsaw game now has buzzsaws.
Oh, yes.
I'm really excited.
It does. Alrighty, so I want to go ahead and make the I want to go ahead and make the cannon able to be walked on. So let's go ahead and do that too. Also, this tree is kind of bothering me. Ignore me while I play around with trees. I think that looks better. That looks less cluttered. Also, that tree really bothers me. Ooh, how did I miss that?
Just say the one by the punchy sticks really bothers me.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, let's make it us able to step on the cannon. To do that, we need to simply set its layer to platforms, or we could create a new layer called cannons, and then set it to cannons, and then set the platform mask of the player to cannons. But let's just set it to platforms for now. Let's say node this object only, so we're only changing the layer of this cannon. Then let's add a box collider 2D to it, which I think that's a pretty good, sensible box collider for it. We might be able to set the Y size just a little bit down-ish. There we go. Now let's hit play, and the player should be able to step on the cannon, which he can. So that's pretty exciting. Oh.
I'm loving it. I'm loving it.
Okay, so we do have a slight problem with the buzzsaws when they're spawned and you're standing on the camera or on the cannon. They decide to not work. So let's go ahead and make them spawn a little bit down so we don't get that. So when we stand, I want to be able to stand on the cannon without getting hit by a buzzsaw. Okay, we still can't. Let's go ahead and change the box collider to be a little bit higher. And remember, most game development is really tweaking like this. Come on, come on, come on, come on.
We also
Yes.
shrink the buzzsaws a little.
Yeah, we can do that too. If we come here, let's go ahead and open up our projectiles. Let's bring in a path projectile red saw, and then let's just scale it down a little bit. And then once we scale it down, hit apply, so the scale will apply to all the objects that are instantiated as these little buzzsaws. And now they look a little bit smaller. Alright, so as far as path projectiles, that's pretty much what I wanted to do. They're just very simple, straightforward projectiles that just shoot out of a cannon and then go into wherever you told them to go into. So I think that pretty much wraps this video up. I mean, obviously you can go and you can copy and paste this cannon all over. You can create all different kinds of projectiles, all different kinds of spawners without even touching a single line of code now. And that's really cool. So I'll see you guys in the next video.